In a way to emulate my hero, One Mind Syndicate, we will continue reading the wiki until we make it. So today we'll be reading, the wiki for Hive Fleet Behemoth. Hive Fleet Behemoth was the first major Tyrannic hive fleet encountered and defeated by the Imperium of Man. The ensuing conflict became known as the First Tyrannic War. The hive fleet was eventually destroyed in 745 of the 31st millennium by the combined might of the Space Marines of the Ultramarines and the Imperial Navy at the Battle of Macrogge, or Battle of Macrogge. History. The first documented attack of a full Tyranid hive fleet upon the Imperium was at a small research station on Tyran Primus. The Tyranids overran this isolated outpost of the Adeptus Mechanicus with overwhelming force and stripped the world of all life. By the time Inquisitor Fidus Critman of the Order of Xenos arrived to investigate the strange stripping phenomenon, it was already too late. However, the adept of the Adeptus Mechanicus who accompanied Critman managed to gather vital information. Before being overrun, Magos Varnak had gathered information on the alien attackers into a data codex and hid it in a bore shaft, some 3,000 meters below the planet's surface, hoping that it would be recovered later by the Imperium. Analyzing the recovered information, Inquisitor Critman managed to warn the Imperium of the new Xenos threat it faced. Honoring an ancient tradition of naming invading alien forces by giving them an appellation drawn from the great beasts of an ancient Terran myth, this first Tyranid hive fleet was designed as Behemoth. Oculus. The next world to fall was Oculus, a moon-sized observatory station caught in the hive fleet Behemoth's path as it pushed onwards past Tyran. The station was a bio-artifact claimed by the Imperium 9,000 standard years earlier, and it was devoured, along with its Mechanicus crew. Jaga. Jaga was the homeworld of the orc freebooters known as the Star Krampus. Their considerable fleet of kill cruisers, once a major threat to the local Imperial shipping, fought the Behemoth in a great naval battle engagement, but was eventually destroyed. The fate of Tandros. Cribman ordered his astropath to send a warning to the Imperium, but the Psyker could not penetrate the warp turmoil left by the passing of an alien fleet and its shadow in the warp. Even the nearby Tandros Telepathica booster matrix was obscured. In desperation, Cribman sent course for the Tandros system in the hopes of re-establishing communication with the Imperium there. It was on this voyage that Cribman realized the scale of the Tyranid threat. Following in the Hive Fleet's wake, Cribman discovered a string of barren worlds that Imperial records indicated should be verdant and lush. Reviewing a solar decade's worth of planetary survey data from the region of space, Cribman saw a pattern emerging. He was able to plot the Hive Fleet's course by the trail of dead and lifeless worlds it had left behind. There was no subtlety to the Hive Fleet's approach, no sense of strategic genius. It merely plowed through the galaxy without stopping, devouring everything in its path with a rambunctious hunger that would become its defining feature. Though Cribman's starship made good speed, the Tyranids had attacked the Tandros system and moved on long before his arrival. Tandros was not as well protected as Tyran, and was likewise overwhelmed by the seemingly endless numbers of biohorrors that flooded its cities and fortifications. The Telepathica Matrix was found to have emptied all of its turret magazines and burned out its defense lasers crystal before being overrun. It was evident that Tandros had fought bravely, but its populace had nonetheless been slaughtered and consumed. Solomts. Solomts is a Necron tomb world ruled by the Necron overlord Tarazin that lay in the path of two minor tendrils of Hive Fleet Behemoth. However, the hive mind recognized the enormous threat presented by the Necrons. So, their bioships made major course corrections to avoid conflict with the Necron forces on Solomts. Eventually, due to the inability of these tendrils to identify any biomass-rich prey worlds, these two tendrils of the behemoth lapsed into hibernation. Sibari. It was not only the forces of the Imperium that suffered great losses due to the arrival of Behemoth. The world of Sibari, a fortress world that served as a stronghold of the Death Shadows Renegade chapter of the Heretic Astartes, was also consumed by the arrival of the Great Devourer. A voice in the dark. With Tandros lost, Cribman's quest became critical. The next system on Hive Fleet Behemoth's path belonged to the realms of Ultramar, and unless it was forewarned, the Imperium might lose its best chance to halt the progress of the Tyrannid onslaught. With haste, Cribman and his agents salvaged what remained of the Tandros Telepathica matrix, and through a Herculean effort, his astropath finally managed to pierce the shadow in the warp to contact the unsuspecting Imperium. The astropath's nose and ears streaming blood from the effort broadcast Cribman's warning. A single voice spoke back from the darkness, and it came from Macrog, the heart of Ultramar, and the homeworld of the Ultramarines chapter of Space Marines. By the grace of the Emperor, Inquisitor Cribman arrived at Ultramar ahead of Hive Fleet Behemoth, and met with Marneus Kalgar, chapter master of the Ultramarines, beneath the portico of his white marble palace. Kalgar stood as a giant before the Inquisitor, his stature grand even among the superhuman warriors of the Space Marines. Kalgar listened intently to the smaller man's words, but Cribman's terrible discoveries did not disturb his noble demeanor. A true heir of their Primarch, Robut Guilliman's genius, and one of the most accomplished military leaders in the Imperium, nothing escaped Kalgar's notice, not one detail about the foe that could be turned into an advantage. Hive Fleet Behemoth was fast approaching, and the Ultramarines chapter prepared for the greatest battle in its history. The Ultramarines were quick to react, and Marneus Kalgar deployed the Ultramarine fleet to stop the Tyrannid Hive Fleet at the garden world of Pradium, the jewel of Ultramar. With gardens and forests of such amazing beauty and genetic craftsmanship, that was considered one of the wonders of the Imperium, a world that the Ultramarines were duty-bound to protect. It was a slaughter, the tactics and strategies decreed by the Codex Astartes, a tome of knowledge created by the Ultramarines Primarch Robut Guilliman to govern all aspects of the Imperial warfare, did not succeed against the Tyrannids. The harrowing strategies of the Ultramarines could not inflict enough damage against the Tyrannids, and the close-range passes of Thunderhawks and other Imperial aircraft and vehicles for optimal firepower favored the Tyrannids' mode of attack even more, since their spore crystals and clawed tentacles could burst or tear open many of the ships that went in on the attack. The Ultramarine fleet had to sacrifice Pradium to consumption by the Hive Fleet. Ill-fated Kalf fell next, ravaged by a smaller force of Tyrannids, seeded by the Hive Fleet's bioships. For a solar week, Marneus Kalgar went without food or water while meditating on the manor. When he came out of his trance-like state, he told the Ultramarines that they had been guilty of the sin of pride. The Codex Astartes was written for the Space Marines. The Space Marines were not created for the Codex Astartes. They would have to adapt and develop new strategies and tactics, even weapons, if they were to be successful against the Tyrannid menace. Hit-and-run raids were abandoned in place of concentrated defenses and static firepower. This meant that the Ultramarines had to choose a place to defend, and they chose their fortress monastery, the Fortress of Hera, on their homeworld Macrog, the very heart of Ultramar. Battle of Macrog. Thanks to Ordo Xenos Inquisitor Cribman's discovery at Traian Primus, the defenders of Macrog had been forewarned of the horror headed towards them. Upon learning of the threat posed to Ultramar by Hive Fleet Behemoth, Marneus Kalgar at once drew up his plans, deeming Macrog to be the star system's most immediately threatened. Kalgar ordered its already formidable defenses to be further improved. A dozen warships already hung in orbit, and each day more arrived from the warp. Massive strike cruisers cast shadows over civilian vessels and Imperial Navy destroyers, and were themselves dwarfed by the brooding presence of the Ultramarines' battle barges. Between this mighty fleet of warships and the planet's no less formidable orbital defense stations, Macrogge was anything but defenseless. Scant solar weeks later, the Outrider vessels of the Tyranid fleet attacked Macrogge. The alien bio-vessel swept aside attacks by the Ultramarine strike cruisers and swarmed over the planet below. Soon many thousands of mycetic spores birthed beasts scurried and rampaged across Macrogge. Deeming that the Tyranid threat was too massive to be opposed piecemeal, Calgar combined his ground forces into 3 mighty armies. The primary and secondary task force, composed largely of 1st Company veterans and the regiments of the Ultramaran Planetary Defense Fortress, bolstered Macrogge's polar fortress against the Tyranid onslaught. Meanwhile, Calgar's task force, the largest of the 3, performed a series of rearguard actions, attempting to slow the Tyranid advance and eliminate High Fleet mind synapse control organisms. Calgar achieved great success in the early days of the campaign, buying time with blood for his battle brothers in the north and south. However, the Tyranids kept coming. In a final climatic battle on Cold Steel Ridge, the Ultramarines' rearguard was brutalized by the Tyranid horde, and Calgar himself was gravely wounded. Knowing that to remain planetside was to doom his followers to wasteful death, Calgar withdrew to the orbiting battle barge Octavius, refusing all but the most vital medical attention. The master of Macrogge took command of the fleet and sought a way to save his world from certain destruction. Hours later, the main Tyranid fleet arrived at Macrogge with no sign of reinforcement. Calgar led his fleet in a series of daring attacks, striking at isolated vessels as they spread out to invade Macrogge in force. Caught between the blistering firepower of Macrogge's polar fortress and the vengeful hammer blows of Calgar's fleet, Tyranid vessels were destroyed by the score, but many more yet remained. As battle raged, the Tyranids unleashed thousands of mycetic spores above the vital polar fortress, and if the fortress were taken, Macrogge's guns would be silenced, and the world left defenseless. So it was that the Tyranids landed in even greater numbers than before, and the fortresses soon found themselves sorely beset. Their gruesome cargo delivered, the battered hive ships retreated from orbit. Trusting to his Ultramarines to keep the fortress secure, Calgar relentlessly pursued the Tyranid fleet, determined that it would not bring ruin to the other worlds. Never before or since has the valor of the Ultramarines been tested as it was in the defense of the polar fortresses. The veteran Space Marines of the 1st Company led the lightly armored Auxilia in a tenacious defense of the fortresses, holding every wall and trench until the last possible moment before it was overrun by the Tyranid swarm. Slowly, the troops withdrew ever deeper into the fortress, while making the Tyranids pay for every single yard of ground they advanced on. The Titans of the Legio Praetor stalked the ice fields and drove smoking furrows through the onrushing Tyranid hordes with shells and plasma. The ferocity of the swarms was unbelievable. At the northern fortresses, they overran the walls by using the steaming piles of their now dead for cover. The Imperial battle titans were dragged down and ripped apart by the sheer weight of numbers. Defenders' gun barrels glowed red hot and jammed in spite of the Arctic cold. Ammunition began to run low even though the fortress had contained stockpiles intended to last for months of siege. Yet still the defenders fought on. Lumbering sights armed carnifexes tore into the defenders' bastions like living battering rams, smashing their way through metal and rockcrete walls with equal fury. The Ultramarines had to rely on heavy short-range firepower to bring down the foe, but for each Tyranid that fell, another 3 sprang forth to continue the fight. Lesser men were paralyzed with terror as the Tyranids broke through the perimeter again and again. But the Ultramarines never despaired and never gave thought to defeat. The Siege of Macrogge. The survivors of the Ultramarines' first company were still believed to be fighting amongst the defense laser silos of the northern citadel, but all contact with them had been lost after the Tyranids overran the surface outposts. Of the southern garrison, nothing was known. Calgar, feeling that the situation was becoming critical, sent the 3rd and 7th Ultramarine companies ahead in their fast strike cruisers while his remaining damaged ships limped back to Macrogge. The Space Marines of the 3rd and 7th companies deployed on the poles by drop pod, their supporting units following up in Thunderhawk gunships. Scenes of unbelievable carnage awaited them below. Piles of mangled Tyranid corpses and shattered battle or war gear lay strewn across the ice. Vast, steaming craters pocked the snow, where Titan plasma reactors had gone critical. The stench of death lay everywhere. The 7th Company landed unopposed at the southern fortress, and quickly linked up with the survivors of the garrison above ground. Together they pushed on to clear the subterranean passages that the Tyranids had overrun. In the north of Macrogge, the 3rd Company came under attack as soon as it landed. Hundreds of creatures emerged from the dark tunnels, mouths, and shattered Imperial bunkers to assault the Space Marines. Only staunch fire laid down by the company's Devastator squads kept the alien swarms at bay until the Thunderhawk gunships arrived to blast the Tyranids back into darkness. Captain Fabian of the 3rd Company prudently awaited the arrival of the company's 3 dreadnoughts before proceeding into the fortress itself to search for survivors. The dark, dank corridors beneath the northern fortress were already altered by the alien presence. Mucus dripped from the walls and ceilings, and a pervasive musky stench filled the air. Alien screams and roars echoed and reverberated along the tunnels. The Space Marines pushed onwards into corridors littered with Tyranid and Ultramarines dead, the darkness reluctantly receding before their suit lights. Cameloid lictors lay in ambush amongst the corpses, lashing into the advanced squads in an orgy of destruction. Eventually, the forward squads used flamers to burn their way along the passages and flush out their enemy. Even as fire consumed them, the creatures still leapt forward with claws outstretched to rend and slay. Cold Steel Ridge. For a time, Calgar's forces successfully slowed the initial land invasion of the Tyranids, trading territory for time as they whittled down the oncoming swarm. Yet even under Marneus Calgar's legendary leadership, such delaying measures would only delay the inevitable. Withdrawing further north, Gene Stealers burst from the sewers beneath the Sirocco starport, slaughtering Macrogge's defenders and pilots before they were brought down by vengeful bolter fire. Much of Calgar's shuttle fleet had been taken out in one fell swoop. Though the Master of Macrogge still had access to sufficient Thunderhawk gunships to supply and maneuver his Ultramarines, he did not possess the auxilia forces that made up the bulk of his defense forces. With options running out, Calgar made a fateful decision to make his stand at Cold Steel Ridge. Having clashed with Calgar's armies numerous times, the Hive Mind had learned much from Calgar and the tactics that he employed. Having identified the Chapter Master as the main threat to the Tyranid advance, the Hive Mind created and dispatched the deadly Tyranid bioform, later classified in Imperial records as the Swarm Lord. The Swarm Lord was the monster who led the final assault on Tyran and Tandros, hoarding strategies of encirclement and misdirection against their human opponents. Those same strategies were employed against Calgar's position on Cold Steel Ridge. Up to this point in the siege, the defenders had become accustomed to the near-mindless tactics of the rampaging swarm, but under the influence of the Swarm Lord, the Tyranid's primal fury was coupled with keen strategy. The Swarm Lord's ploy resulted in the deaths of dozens of battle brothers. On the eastern flank, Calgar watched grimly as the Swarm Lord's plan unfolded. As he led the counter-assault against the Carnifex brood, Calgar recognized the malevolent intelligence within the creature. Quickly realizing that his enemy was not the mindless swarm it had first seemed to be. With the foe reeling, the Swarm Lord extended its will and 10,000 alien minds answered. Raveners and Trigons burst from the chill ground in the midst of man's trenches, separating the beleaguered defenders from Calgar's main force. By the time the Ultramarines cut through the subterranean swarms, the trench network was a charnel of gore overrun with Tyranids. The Ultramarines purged them with fire, but in doing so left the Swarm Lord's true target, the mighty Baneblade, pride of Hera, without infantry support. A wave of Carnifexes tore the super heavy tank apart. With this destruction, the Imperial western flank was lost. Over the next few solar hours, the full depth of the monster's battle plan became apparent, as hundreds of auxiliary troops were killed in the most gruesome ways imaginable, as the Swarm Lord employed wave after wave of the various Tyranid bioforms at his disposal. Calgar and his Ultramarines fought tirelessly, in an attempt to bolster the weakened sections of their battle lines as only an Astartes could, reacting to each new threat with valor. But they were outnumbered and outmatched. Under the direction of the nefarious Swarm Lord, the Swarm was able to adapt to defeat Calgar's tactics as quickly as the Chapter Master developed them. Then suddenly, the Swarm Lord bellowed a challenge to the human commander. Leading a bodyguard of Tyrant Guards and Tyranid warriors, the monstrous Hive Tyrant plunged into the fray. Seeing their chapter master beset, the Ultramarines hastened to their lord's aid, but soon found themselves assailed from an unexpected quarter. Not all of the Hormigons on their left flank were lifeless corpses, for some of the creatures had been lying dormant amongst the corpses of their kin, their ravenous instincts suppressed by the Swarm Lord's will. As the Swarm Lords charged the master of Macrog, the Hormigons were released from their slumber to fall upon the Ultramarines with fury. Though their numbers was not great enough to do more than delay the Ultramarines, that delay could prove costly. Calgar was laid low, his body rent and torn. Unfortunately, or fortunately should I say, his honor guard fought before their wounded chapter master, their axes of Ultramar driving the Swarm Lord back from the body of their fallen lord. Too late, the Thunderhawk gunships arrived from the orbiting battle barge Octavius, their first pass blasting the swarm back from the ridge to allow 3 of their number to land amongst the packed bodies of the dead and retrieve survivors. The honor guard was only able to get Calgar to safety due to the valiant sacrifice of brother Aloysius, commander of the guard, who held his ground alone against the Swarm Lord and his tyrant guard. Yet as Aloysius fell, the Thunderhawks were able to lift off, carrying the few dozen survivors to safety. Because of the Ultramarines' noble sacrifice, Barneus Calgar will live to fight again. But the army of Ultramar was no more. The polar fortresses were now on their own. The war in space. The battle on the ground had fared poorly, but the war in space was nothing less than disastrous. The first assault wave of the Tyranid fleet had claimed the mighty battle barge Caesar. The third wave saw the destruction of the better part of the Ultramar's merchant fleet as a swarm of Void Fiends slipped through the perimeter breach caused by the Caesar's destruction. By the ninth wave, Macrog's Starnova stations had become body carnal houses, rendered into mere husks of debris left spinning in the cold void of space. When the 12th assault wave occurred, the orbital defenses of Macrog were all but obliterated. Macrog now lay undefended, and the Tyranid invasion intensified. The Hive ships capitalized on their victory, releasing thousands upon thousands of mycetic spores directly onto Macrog's polar fortresses. However, the war in space was not yet concluded. Refusing all but the most vital medical aid, Calgar took command of the surviving vessels and began to harry the Hive fleet as it spread out to surround Macrog. Its forces deployed on the planet's surface. The Hive mind chose to withdraw its bioships from Macrog in order to lure the defending ships away and thus preventing them from coming to the polar fortress's aid. Calgar took the Tyranid's bait and pursued the Tyranid fleet onward towards the ringed world of Circe at the edge of the Macrog system, but not without a plan of his own. The timely arrival of the Imperial Navy's entire battle fleet Tempestus from Baca finally sealed the Tyranids' fate by catching them in a vice between the two fleets. Even now, the Imperial fleet was overmatched, for the Tyranids were too many. However, the Hive Mind's victory was short-lived. The battle would have been lost, save for the heroic sacrifice of the great battleship Dominus Astra. Charging into the heart of the Hive Fleet, the huge Emperor-class battleship detonated its warp drives, creating a warp vortex that dragged both it and the entire Tyranid's fleet to oblivion. Caught between the guns of two Imperial fleets, nearly all of Hive Fleet Behemoth's bioships were destroyed. A scant few, scarred and battered, slipped away into the depths of space. Though it had suffered a grievous defeat, the galaxy had not heard the last of Behemoth. With the Hive Fleet destroyed, Calgar's surviving starships came about and roared back to Macroc to try to save the beleaguered polar garrisons. Last stand of the First Company. And through the war was won at Circe. The only question that remained was whether Macroc would be lost in the process. While the battle raged in space, the valor of the Ultramarines was being tested as never before on the surface. Through the darkness and terrors unimaginable, the Third Company finally reached the lower Penitorium, where the Astartes defenders had made their last stand. Tyranid bodies were piled 6 deep around the doors, and within the room a circle of Terminators lay where they had fought back to back. Each had given his life for his brothers. The Ultramarines' First Company had been wiped out to the last man. The Battle of Macroc remains a great source of both sorrow and pride for the Ultramarines. The names of its fallen are commemorated each year at the Feast of Days, their sacrifice remembered throughout Ultramar with honor and gratitude. But the cost had been great. The Ultramarines' First Company was gone, and the Third and Seventh sorely diminished. It would be many long years before the chapter could properly replace its losses, but replace them it would. The Ultramarines would endure. The Behemoth falls. When the fleet-bound Ultramarines returned to Macroc, they found the landscape subsumed by carnage. Though a few survivors were found in the ruins of Macroc's southern fortresses, none were discovered in the north. The body of a hive tyrant believed to be the Swarm Lord was found on the corpse-littered ice fields outside the northern polar fortresses, but the damage it had sustained made it impossible to identify with certainty. Rumors persist that the beast had somehow escaped death and that the Tyranids would one day return. It would be solar decades before the truth was revealed. Since the Battle of Macri, this is the aftermath of Macroc, the Ultramarines have become instrumental in the Imperium's wars against other Tyranid hive fleets. In the aftermath of the Battle of Macroc, the Ultramarines were faced with the Herculean task of rebuilding their most experienced body of veteran warriors, the First Company. Responsibility for this undertaking fell to Chaplain Ortanus Cassius, whose hatred for the Tyranids and all they had done to the worlds of mankind knew no bounds. Cassius petitioned Marneus Calgar for the authorization to raise a new body of Ultramarines, drawn from the ranks of those Astartes who had survived the first Tyrannic War. Only those Space Marines who had been tested like he had could truly understand the threat posed by the Tyranids. Marneus Calgar eventually accepted the chaplain's request. With the chapter master's sanction given, for the first time in the chapter's history, the dictates of the Codex Astartes were rewritten. The chaplain gathered his corpse of Tyrannic war veterans. Under Cassius' leadership, those battle brothers who had fought the hardest against the Tyranid swarm that had assaulted Macreagh were elevated and offered additional duties, until each was eventually judged worthy of joining the ranks of the slowly reconstituted First Company. These Tyrannic War veterans make up the first and most powerful of the chapter's reformed First Company, and are second to no other warriors of the Imperium because of their experience, training, and upgraded power armor. Though a minor deviation from the Codex Astartes, Marneus Calgar tolerates his mentor's divergence from its sacred tenets, sensing that someday there shall be another reckoning between the Ultramarines and the Tyranids. and that Cassius' Tyrannic war veterans may be the key to the final victory. As for the small Tyranid fleets that escaped, well, they would escape and grow large once more, possessing a threat to the Imperium. But for now, things were looking good. Until, of course, we got the second Tyrannic invasion, or war.